So thank you so much for this intimate evening gathering, evening depending on where you are. And we're going to kick it over to our chair, Scott Stone.
All right, thanks, Grace, and thanks to everybody for dialing in tonight. Very excited to have Shelton joining us. And Shelton, I'd like to, I'm going to introduce you briefly, explain a little bit about the American Park Experience Award and how it dovetails with the Park Trust's mission, and then get into some questions, and I'll just try to keep up with you for the rest of our time together. So for those who haven't figured it out, Shelton Johnson is a park ranger with the National Park Service, has been working in Yosemite National Park for, now Shelton, it's 29 years? Is that about right?
I've been with Yosemite since December of '93, so it's about 30 now.
About 30, okay.
I'm
We'll
not
count
keeping count. I'm not keeping count because it's alarming to me.
Absolutely. You started your career at Yellowstone back in 1987. And if Shelton seems familiar, he really took a star turn in the Ken Burns documentary series, The National Parks, America's Best Idea, originally broadcast in the fall of 2009. Shelton screened the film at the White House with President Barack Obama. And I couldn't help but mention this little factoid: successfully facilitated Oprah Winfrey's first ever camping trip at Yosemite, which always jumps out when doing background research. Most relevant to tonight, Shelton is the recipient of the National Park Trust's American Park Experience Award. Sometimes we call it the APEX Award. This is an award that we've given to people and groups that have gone out of their way and done extraordinary service in support of our national parks. Ken Burns himself is a prior winner. Former Secretary of the Interior, Ken Salazar, another winner. Another former Interior Secretary and CEO of REI, Sally Jewell, have also won. And the important thing about the APEX Award is how much it dovetails with the Park Trust's mission. Our mission is, as I'm sure you've heard, we preserve parks today, create park stewards for tomorrow. This means both acquiring missing pieces of the national parks, when privately owned land inside or alongside parks becomes available, the Department of Interior or the Park Service can't quite move in and get it in time. The Park Trust, thanks to its extraordinary cadre of donors, is able to come in, acquire the land, and then convey it to the park, literally enlarging the size of our parks. And then we connect thousands of kids from across the country, from underserved communities, to our parks. These are the future stewards, caretakers of these priceless resources. So Shelton, so glad that we have you here today, and wanted to ask you, in the context of the APEX Award, we were able to present it to you last May at Yosemite, a beautiful ceremony. The weather cooperated, which we know is not always a guarantee. And to ask you to start us off by sharing a little bit about what it meant to you to receive that kind of recognition for your service to the parks, to the communities that you've managed to connect to the parks, how that's connected to your own story. A kid from Detroit. It's a long road to Yosemite, and we know it wasn't a straight one. That you had a lot of interesting turns, and how all that has resonated with you and connected you to the APEX Award.
Well, I think that what's key to point out is that I'm basically a field employee, meaning I'm a field park ranger. I'm in a management role now, but most of my career I've been active as an interpretive park ranger in Yellowstone, Great Basin, Yosemite, and Washington, D.C. So when I was had the honor of receiving the APEX Award, and I always think of it in these terms. Whenever you win an award, look at the previous recipients of that award, and that'll tell you something about the significance. So when I saw that Sally Jewell, former Secretary of the Interior, Ken Salazar, former Secretary of the Interior and current ambassador to Mexico, Ken Burns and Dayton Duncan, that was overwhelming in and of itself. And then when I saw the video and they were talking about the work that I've been doing for many years, that was as overwhelming literally as the award itself. So from my perspective, it's not so much about me, it's more about the work that I've been doing. I've been passionate about connecting communities of color, in particular African Americans, who are the one group least likely to seek out a wilderness experience or a national park experience. That's been my own personally granted mission since I've been a park ranger, since I started out in Yellowstone as a concession employee in 1984. So I see this as an arc. You know, when there's an electric spark that starts, there's an arc going from positive to maybe to negative. And I just see where we are right now, where I am right now in Yosemite, as the culmination of that arc, which it really was sparked when I was a kid in Detroit, and primarily when I was with my parents in Germany, where I attended kindergarten. I'm mentioning that because that's the seed, that's the beginning of that thunderbolt for me, was experiencing Berchtesgaden before it became a national park, being in the Black Forest before it became a national park back in the 1960s. And if it had not been for those experiences, then I wouldn't be a park ranger. I would not have chosen this career because I grew up in an urban inner city area in Detroit. And no one I knew in my community visited national parks. They never even spoke about national parks. It would be like Neil Armstrong talking about what it was like to be in the sea of tranquility on the surface of the moon. It was a completely different universe, the national parks, compared to the world that I was living in. So just the fact that right now, at this moment, we're having this conversation, and when I'm thinking of the echoing effect of looking back a few months ago to being in Yosemite Valley in that wintry day, sometimes when I was standing there, I'm thinking, how did all of this happen? And I think it did happen primarily because of that seed that was planted in me when I was a kid in Germany. And that's why I've been so passionate about connecting communities of color to national parks, because I want every child in America to have a national park experience, because every childhood spent in this country deserves a childhood of wonder, of disbelief, of astonishment. And that's really what drives me. And that's what continues to drive me as well. So I'm still that little inner city kid from Detroit who had the fortune of being able to close his eyes and have memories of walking through the Black Forest, and have memories of being high up in a precipice and looking down into a deep canyon in Berchtesgaden, high in the Bavarian Alps. That was the first gift, and that led to many others.
When you're at a national park, I feel like just getting there, if you're a kid from a community that sometimes across the country are quite close, but they've just lacked the opportunity to go that last mile or however many miles to get into the park. But then once there, forging that connection, it doesn't take much, I think, does it? I mean, sometimes it's just being there and being able to see, what a park looks like, what it feels like, and smells like.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, you've connected so many, kids. You've delivered for them those kind of aha moments. Is there something special you look for, or something you work toward? Is it intuitive, instinctive? Do you plan for it? But when you're with a group of kids, particularly kids who would not maybe have never been to a park, would say, but for the National Park Trust or another program, ever see a park. How conscious are you that you are giving them that same kind of moment that you once felt in the Black Forest years ago?
It's what drives me, because I'm still in that moment. I'm still that little kid who was 5 years old at the edge of a precipice in the Bavarian Alps. So I'm still there, and those kids are still there. And so for me, what's so important about that moment when I'm in their presence and they are in the presence of Yosemite itself, the Yosemite, as it used to be referred to 100 years ago, is that I'm there as a facilitator of their own astonishment. And I wish I could put that on my business card where it read, what do you do for a living? I'm an astonishment facilitator. Because for me, if you're an interpretive ranger, that's exactly that edge of one world where it infringes on another. That's where you're trying to put people in that space where they can look out and just, and that breathing in of breath, which literally is where the word inspiration comes from, is the breathing in of spirit. And for me, whether you're at the edge of the Grand Canyon, whether you're walking through the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoia, whether you're hiking up in the North Cascades, wondering if there's a grizzly bear right around the edge of the trail or beyond the trail, it's those moments of astonishment that people who have historically felt that these places belong to them, but for many communities of color, it's a foreign country. It literally feels it's just something that no one in your community has ever talked about. And so as a result, and of course, this is another important point, the tourism was never inflected toward communities of color until fairly recently. And so as a result, we have no idea as a group, as cultures, as groups, ethnic groups, that these places have the beauty that they have. And that's why I refer to it as a crisis of translation, because when you think the word park or imagine the word park and you're from an inner city environment, you're looking at an area that does not obviously have the grandeur of the south rim of the Grand Canyon, that view down into infinity itself. So that's what drives me more than anything else, is to remember all the kids that have not had that experience and how they're lacking in that experience of wonder and that experience of astonishment. And from my point of view, every child in America should have an experience of that astonishment with the world itself. And the lack thereof takes away what we refer to as childlike wonder. Because when you're a kid, everything, literally everything around you is miraculous. You can hold a pencil in front of a kid, and if they've never seen a pencil before, they're astonished by it. But imagine replacing that pencil with a thunderbolt, a strike of lightning, if you're high up in the Absaroka Range, in Wyoming, and you see that for the first time. I think that childhoods are an experience of wonder, and there's no better place than to have that experience in America's wonderlands. And if I'm elected.
Yeah, yeah, I know. That's the second half. That's the second half. There's a line by the science fiction author Ursula Le Guin. I'm a big fan, and that I liked a lot, which says, the imaginative adult is the child who survived. And I feel like, you have this opportunity to not only spark that in kids, but I mean, I know I can speak for myself, but I'm sure other members of the board, Park Trust staff, all of those that were at there in last May, you feel it when you're all grown up too. And, watching you interact with one of the Buddy Bison schools from the park that came, as you might recall, I let my 13-year-old son tag along, and while we were climbing, hiking Glacier Point, he snapped a lot of photos, and you did that to him where you're like, hang on, let me see that. Well, those are some good photos. And you guys geeked out over the photos on his phone. And for the rest of the trip, for weeks afterward, it's, hey, Dad, did you see this one? Did you see this one? Most of the time it's fine. A few times I'm like, son, I'm driving on these really narrow, windy park roads. Let's look, after we've gotten there. But it's a magical thing. And I feel like it's something that is sort of obvious about the parks, but seeing the way you do it really brings out just how vital and just how essential this is in serving the National Park Service's mission. And of course, serving the Park Trust mission as well. Let me ask you about, one of your mentors, Bob Stanton, who I think I'd like to claim him as a mentor too. I've got to spend a little time with Bob. He's extraordinary. And for those who don't know, he's a great friend of the National Park Trust as well. He was a ranger himself in Grand Teton in the 60s. And I think at the time, one of the first, if not, very few African-American rangers in the 1960s at a park. Also was the first African-American and only National Park Trust director during the Clinton administration. And, for those who know, we owe Bob a great debt in sparking the creation of the Park Trust's Buddy Bison program when he was part of the Obama administration's transition team, bringing in Grace and our former board chair who's here today, Bill Brownell, about making sure that, we reach out to underserved communities. We reach out to kids that, wouldn't already get to the park. And I'm wondering, Bob, it mirrors, I think, a lot of your own life. How does that make you feel? Tell us kind of your side of that and why, that's such an important part of working for the Park Service.
Well, when you're an inner city kid, especially an inner city kid who is African American, and you don't see yourself reflected in nature shows as a child growing up. And then as an adult for myself, when I arrived in Washington, D.C., Bob Stanton was the regional director. So that was a thunderbolt for me. I keep going back to thunderbolts and lightning because there's an electricity that is in the air when you're in a national park. But when you meet certain individuals, there's a transference of that energy from them to us. And I felt that when I was in the presence of Bob, because he started out as a park ranger and worked his way up, to a regional director, and then he became the director for the Park Service. So for me, when I think of Bob, the first thing I think of is that he asked me to ride in his place in the Tournament of Roses parade. And so that's how I met Bob. I'm riding in the Tournament of Roses parade with the chief for the Forest Service and the leader, the woman who was the leader for the Arizona Office of the Bureau of Land Management. And my supervisor told me, whatever you do, don't fall off your horse, you know who you're representing. And so we've had this relationship since then of he's really my mentor. I mean, I really look up to him, not so much just as the director, a former director of the Park Service, but because of his vision. And the thing that is key to point out that it is so important that the Park Service, the Forest Service, or what have you, visionaries have a role. People who are not just occupying a position, but have a dream, literally, and want to make that dream manifest, make it real in the world. And for Bob, part of that mission was to make certain that the parks began to diversify. And that didn't start really until the 1960s, when JFK was president and Stuart Udall was the Secretary of the Interior. That's really when things started to shift. And Bob was part of that. That's when he became a park ranger in Grand Teton National Park. So he's always been an inspiring figure to me, starting out in the ranks, so to speak. And he still is an inspiring figure for me. You get an example of where the parks should be heading, and they are heading there. But I think to a great degree, that inflection was pushed by Bob Stanton back in the 1960s. Yeah. Now I don't know if I fully answered your question, because once I start going, I just get into a flow. But so
no, I know.
If you want to redirect me, let me know.
That was great. That was great. And all right, so that was recent history. And let's think about history more writ large. We just caught the last day of Black History Month. And, I know in hearing you, talk about the parks and how they've sort of caught up to better reflecting everything in the United States. I think that the, African-American story has been a big part of that. You've done some extraordinary work in helping to kind of unearth stories that going back to the inception of the Park Service and the creation, sometimes quite literally, of national parks with the Buffalo Soldiers. And I know we could probably spend a whole day just talking about everything there, but I'm wondering if you could share with us what first led you to seeking out those stories, or how you first found them, and how you've unearthed them and shared them, and what their reception has been like.
I would say that the key to where you're heading me is the whole idea of an untold story, the whole notion of a hidden history, because it's not just hidden histories that focus on the legacies of African Americans or Asian Americans or Native Americans or Latina. It's just that when the rangers that are in the field are primarily Euro-American and male, the stories that will naturally resonate with them will be the stories of people who look like them, who are also Euro-American and male. It's just like attracts like. It's just the way that human beings as primates function. And the result of that, unfortunately, is that the stories that should be told and should be heard by the audience, those stories are not communicated necessarily, and those stories are not heard by those folks who visit the parks expecting to hear stories that somehow reflect themselves. It's a little bit like of the Greek myth of Echo and Narcissus. We want to see ourselves reflected in the world, and we want to hear ourselves reflected in the world. And so that's a huge part of it. It's just part of human nature. But if all those stories aren't being told, then that's where we can fail, and that's where we are failing. And I think that the whole notion of a hidden history needs to go beyond notion. And I think we need an untold story core. need a core of young people that could visit national parks and say, why are you here? Well, I know you have untold stories because of the history of your park that was primarily Euro-American and male. So we're looking for stories about women and stories about people of color and see what role they may have played. And that history is there, and it is usually and often hiding in plain sight. But I think it's really significant. How is that for in empowering for a young person in graduate school to literally play a role in unearthing a story that no one has heard before? And I'm only the third person in the Yosemite's history, the third person in the last 60 years to develop a program about buffalo soldiers, even though those soldiers built the first trail to the top of Mount Whitney, the first usable wagon road into Sequoia's giant forest, and what is considered to be the first museum in what would become the national park system. You'd think with those accomplishments, it would be a no-brainer that we would be communicating those stories, but that's the insidious nature of how the lens through which we peer can affect what we perceive as being of great value or no value whatsoever.
So when and by the way, I've noticed our connection is a little jumpy. Is it me or is everyone else able to copy clearly?
Oh, it might be the weather catching up with Shelton a little bit in Yosemite. So we'll keep an eye on it. How are you seeing things, Shelton?
You folks seem to be fine, but I did hear a little bit of a lag in my voice at some point. At this point where I am, it's raining, it's snowing up high, but you're still clear. I'm not seeing any break in the visual quality, just occasionally there was a lag in the voices.
Okay. All right, good.
We'll soldier on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Shelton, just holler if on your end things seem to lag, and Dolores, you and I can keep an eye on things. Keep an eye on things here. Well, okay. So what I wanted to follow up with that is when you have not only found stories and untold stories and brought them to people, but you've performed them as well. And I wanted to see if you could tell us a little bit about, what prompted you to do that and how that goes, because, the Park Service has great signs and there's great information on the signs. But in my mind, there are two kinds of people that stop and read every word on every sign, and people that just blow right by them and just want to keep getting on down the trail and, move on with it. And the signs are great, but no matter how great the sign, what you've done, and maybe you could put words to it, you've actually, performed, in character some of these stories. And, what prompted you to do that? What goes into that? And why is that so important, notwithstanding all the wonderful signage in our national parks?
I think for me, it was just an issue of the story itself. When you can't talk about Buffalo Soldier history, you can't talk about African American history, prior to 1970 without getting into race, without talking about racism, without talking about genocide, particularly with Native people. These are very difficult subjects. And so when you're talking about a difficult subject in the third person, people can react defensively to what you're saying. But when you're talking about those difficult subjects in the first person, when you shift the pronouns from this is what happened to them, and this is how they must have felt, to this is what happened to me, and this is how I felt, then somehow it is easier for folks who are not of that culture to more comfortably take in that information. Because conversations about race tend to push people away. But if you're a storyteller, your goal is to pull people into the story, not push them out of the story. And the best way to do that, I recognized early on, was to do a first-person interpretive kind of presentation with Buffalo Soldiers, because it would make it more difficult for people to discount what I was saying when I was saying, this is what happened to me. I mean, you think about it, say, this is what I experienced. It's hard to argue that. But if someone were to say, this was their experience, that gives you enough wiggle room to just say, well, how do you know that was their experience? And who do we define as the they that you're referring to? So given that most of the audiences at the time I began my program were Euro-American, not as many African Americans, and not as many Latinx folks, and folks that were definitely Asia, but often they were from Asia. I mean, folks literally from Japan and China and so forth. I just realized that if you're dealing with a barrier, figure out some way of getting around that barrier in terms of the expression of the story. And the best way to do that was to make it more of a diary, a personal attestation of what happened to an individual, as opposed to this is what it was like for them. It brought the story to life. Is real. History has the power to change people's perceptions of what has happened in the past. And so when you're talking about a story that no one has ever heard before, the initial reaction is disbelief. And that's what I faced in Yosemite. People hadn't really heard the story, even though I was still a third person to tell it. So when suddenly people are hearing that there were African-American soldiers in Yosemite and they've never heard it before, their initial reaction was it couldn't have happened, because if it had happened, why haven't I heard about it? And that's where race plays in. That's where bias plays in. It puts you in a situation, or people in a situation, where they have a pair of glasses on, but they've never had the wherewithal to ask themselves, what am I seeing? What am I allowed to see because of this specific prescription on these lenses? And what is it that I no longer can see because of the specific prescription that I'm wearing? But when you become conscious of those lenses, it makes it easier to figure out how to approach the communication of something that is difficult to hear. And the story of the Buffalo Soldiers is a story of race. It's a story of genocide. It's a story of all these terrible things that happen, but it's the truth. And you have to figure out ways of telling the truth so that people can ingest it. Just like when you're a kid, it's hard to take that castor oil, but if somebody mixes it in with something sweet, mix it in with something that tastes good, it's literally easier to swallow. And that's why when I'm doing my program, I inject it with humor, the natural humor that comes out of painful situations. We try to make light out of something difficult to make it easier, to make it bearable, literally. And so that's what I do in my program, so that way, when people are open up, because I'm saying something that's funny, that the heart opens up, and then while that heart is open, that's the doorway you walk through, and then you shift gears, and that's when you put that seed that has pain associated with it, that has discomfort associated with it. But I had to figure this all out as I there was no primer saying this is what you do. I just had to figure it out as I was going in these performances.
Yeah. So some of the mechanics of it, because I completely agree, that when you do that, the character is the story in many respects. And it can, convey things subliminally that no matter how articulate you might be in your Park Service uniform, could get lost and as it's communicated. But once upon a time, there was a day where you're like, okay, you know what? I think I'm going to dress up as a Buffalo Soldier and talk to people. Like, tell us how that came about. Was this, just your idea? Did you have to ask permission? What were you thinking about as you put it together? How did it kind of all happen for you, and then become something that, of course, took off, and we all see the legacy of it, the benefits of it. But at some point, there was a moment right before you'd done this for the first time. What was that like?
It was scary because the story was so significant. It was so important. I knew I had to be at my absolute best. So the first thing I started to do was to not think of it as living history. That's a lower bar. I'm a living history interpreter. I had to think of myself as an actor. And so I said to myself, what would Morgan Freeman do in this situation? What would Denzel Washington do in this situation? What would a classically trained actor in both theater and the stage as well in film do? And that's how it started. That's how it started. I had to start thinking of myself as an actor, not as a living history interpreter. And so I'm thinking Marlon Brando. I'm thinking, I'm not necessarily thinking Elia Kazan and On the Waterfront, and I'm not going around going, Stella, like that. But at the same time, when you set that up as the bar, that became the bar. So I became a method actor. And I didn't just create a character. I created an entire backstory for that character that eventually became a novel. So the result was that I knew that character, that person so well, because I didn't think of him as a character. I thought of him as an alter ego, which literally means another I, not just even a persona. It's me, but not me. It's Clark Kent and Superman, but there was something I had to strip away to reveal that which was hidden, that which was powerful for myself. And I'm only human. I have these frailties, but this was a time 100 years ago where frailties were not allowed for African Americans. Frailties were not allowed. Weaknesses were not allowed for women. Weaknesses were not allowed for certain groups because that weakness would be exploited by the dominant culture at the time. So how can you be an entitled, empowered African American in 1900 and go through the world without arousing the hatred of groups like the Ku Klux Klan? Well, you have to be the most ambassadorial person alive. You have to know when to be circumspect and when to be strong, and to be able to shift those gears effortlessly in order to survive. And so that was the grounding that was right there. I realized that telling the story was essentially walking on a tightrope over a chasm filled with lava. The slightest misstep and I'm falling into the flames. Or dancing in a minefield was another analogy that I used. And the minefield was a minefield of race and class and sexism. I mean, everything that we can think of is bad back then. And then you have the people who have partnerships like partnerships like Frederick Douglass joining with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and with the women's suffrage movement. There was just all these tie-ins, and I realized that I knew how to be this person because my father grew up in South Carolina, and I grew up hearing all of these stories of what South Carolina was like in the 30s and 40s. So what I'm saying is I had to graft my own personal history onto the story of the Buffalo Soldiers that was formalized in the archive. And once I made that graft with the personal to that which was separate from me, that's what brought it to life. And the time I heard, when I found out that it worked, was at Allensworth State Park. At Allensworth State Park during their centennial, I performed. And there was a woman there that was 103 years old who was African American. And she gave me the greatest compliment I've ever heard for any of my performances. She said, young man, when you were talking, I could hear my daddy speaking through you.
Wow.
I've never heard anything before since that made me feel, and all I was doing when I'm performing, I'm channeling my father because he served in Korea, he served in Vietnam. So I'm channeling him, but he was born and raised in South Carolina. And so he dealt with that Jim Crow period firsthand. And so that gave me that window to peer into this history and to see what was unseen and to feel what was unfelt. If you were just straight historian and looking just at the primary documentation.
Yeah. So what's to me remarkable about that is how much of history is actually still with us that we're channeling unconsciously. I increasingly say stuff my dad, would say after being, when I was younger, making great fun of him with my siblings for him saying those kinds of things. But it brings to mind this idea that, we are constantly channeling parts of this history, even as there are some parts that do get lost and that do get kind of cabined off. And so the thing I wanted, to ask you is, how complete did it feel for you as that character? And were you full method while doing it? I mean, you're just in character from when you pull up to when you go, or are you able to kind of shift back and forth, in transforming into a Buffalo Soldier and then back to being Shelton, or do you need to just kind of lock in for, the day in order to do this?
I would say it's more like Daniel Day-Lewis, who's also a method actor, or Marlon Brando. It's like, once I'm in character, it's easier to just stay in character. But the key thing is, again, I don't think of that individual, that persona, as a character. I think of it as an alter ego, another I. Given differences in circumstances with time and space, it's me in another place. And then how would I respond as who I am in that same environment, growing up in rural South Carolina, as my dad did. So it's that kind of level of transference. But the problem with that is that it puts you there. And when it puts you in a place you don't really ever want to visit, that's where the discomfort comes in. So the first thing I had to do to be successful in that program was to become comfortable with my own discomfort, to be comfortable talking about race, to become comfortable talking about the genocide of indigenous people, and then recognizing that the stories that I'm telling are about myself, because I'm African, Cherokee, Seminole, and Irish. So I have family members that were on the coffin ships from Ireland. I have family members that were on the slave ships. I have family members that survived the Trail of Tears and participated in the Indian Wars. And so I realized it's like I'm a delta with all those different streams and rivers flowing in. So all I have to do is stay true to those waters and let them speak through me. It's not me telling the story, let them tell the story through me. And that's what I do when I'm on stage. I try not to be Shelton acting. I try to be a mouthpiece for those spirits that are within me. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Is there a story that you feel you haven't told yet that you'd like to tell? At something at Yosemite, something elsewhere at the within the Park Service, or just California, or wherever? Do you feel like there's another untold story that's kind of brewing that you'd like to bring forward?
I thought about George Monroe, the African-American stage driver in Yosemite, who was one of the most renowned stage drivers literally in the West. I mean, who literally, when he was at the range, there was little to fear about a mishap because he was so skilled. The term they used at the time was not a stage driver, but a reinsman. And so I thought that him being African-American and having taken in personally 3 different presidents, and then entertainers such as Lily Langtry. I mean, he was just renowned as one of the great reinsmen or great stage drivers in the West. So that was the first person whose story I was going to tell until I got into the Buffalo Soldier history. But I've always thought about going back and telling the story of George Monroe.
That's great.
Scott,
how
I'm
much did this-
I'm gonna cut in and see if we have any questions from the group, if that's okay with you. And I'm going to be selfish and start with one of my own, Shelton. When before people arrived, we were talking about Yosemite. And when we were there in May, I remember hearing we got to see some waterfalls that hadn't been visible for a couple of years, some of the smaller ones. And so with the weather that you've been having, can you share with folks what they might expect to see this spring if they come to Yosemite in terms of the river and the waterfalls?
I would say what's brewing right now is one of the greatest waterfall seasons in the history of Yosemite National Park. It actually might be too good because there's just so much snow. I mean, we've received so much snow, and we're getting snow right now that I've been here over 25 years, and having 8 atmospheric rivers hit California. Now we're in the midst of this new cold wave that's dumping even more snow. And snow in Yosemite Valley. When all of that starts to melt, it's going to be absolutely astonishing. Hopefully it won't be like the flood where we had literally dozens and dozens of waterfalls in Yosemite Valley. But I think it's going to be a great year for people who are interested in seeing waterfalls in Yosemite. It's just a question of the timing. Hopefully it doesn't happen. Hopefully it doesn't get too warm too soon. That's where flooding can come in. Hopefully it's a gradual bleed off of the snowpack as opposed to going from winter weather right to summer weather. That's what we don't need. But this year is probably going to be absolutely remarkable. And I just was communicating with someone who was outside the park, and she was going to bring her kids with her. And I said, well, based on the timing of you're coming in, you may see the lunar rainbow. I don't know if you folks have seen the moonbow in the spray of Lower Yosemite Fall, but they're going to be here just 2 days away from the full moon. And I just said, you need to do that. You need to see it because it's one of the closest things to a spiritual experience outside a mosque, a temple, a cathedral, or a church. So
Oh no!
Oh, we lost Shelton.
Let's see if they'll hop back on.
Yeah, I'm sure he'll hop back on. If people want to either unmute now or type a question into the chat when Shelton comes back.
He's back, Dolores.
Oh, okay.
He's
great.
Back.
I'm back. You can't get rid of me that easily.
that was a quick count. You're right back on your feet.
Yeah, I'm back up. So what I'm saying is this is going to be a great year for our waterfall season, but it also could be a dangerous year because of the amount of snow that we've received and are still receiving. So the warning that I gave to this particular individual is just keep your kids close at hand. Don't let them get close to any water source, whether it's a stream, a creek, or a river. Don't let them get too close because you don't want them to slip and fall. It's just be careful. But yeah, definitely, it's going to be a great year. But people have to be careful and of the situational awareness. That's going to be the phrase that I think a lot of Park Service folks are going to be using, just for parents to be really mindful of what they're getting into before they get into it. And because it's water, and most 50 to 60% of our bodies is water, so it's like attracts like. It's this pull to a waterfall. There's a pull to a river that's flowing by, and that pull is just that it's magnetic. And I think that the problem with that is that danger hides in that great beauty, and that's one of the challenges with national parks in general. There's a term that the great biologist, he just passed away not too long ago, E.O. Wilson, he used the term biophilia, that we're just naturally drawn to life itself. And for us, water is literally the arteries of the planet itself. It's where, without liquid water, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. So I think that's why there's this magnetic pull to waterfalls, but people just have to be careful about getting too close. For me, it's a magnetic pull to history, because I feel that there's this continuous flow from the past to the present to the future, and that's what drew me to this history, and made it and enabled me to tell the story as well, because I felt that I wasn't just telling their story, I was telling our story, a human story that everyone needed to hear and that everyone could benefit from in the telling.
Bill, I
That's
like
great,
your
Shelton.
screensaver in the back.
What's that?
Yeah.
Hi.
Well, I actually have a question for Shelton, so I wanted to come on. I've got a Yosemite picture in the background, which is a lot better than the first picture I took from that spot, where I came into Yosemite at night. There was a full moon up over Half Dome. It was gorgeous. So I took out my cell phone and took this picture, which I thought was going to be the most beautiful picture in the world. Looked at it the next day. It's a black screen with a dot of light in the middle. You don't do nighttime pictures like that with a cell phone.
And Bill, what you're describing is when those folks that try to capture the lunar rainbow, I mean, they can see it right there in front of them, the moonbow right there in the spray of Lower Yosemite Fall. And then unless you really know what you're doing or have the right kind of equipment, it's like, it's there. Why didn't I can't see it, but it's there. I saw it.
Yeah. But, your remarks got me thinking about something about the National Park Trust program. And it's probably more of a rhetorical question, something for further thought. But, we've done all of this work to get kids, particularly city kids, inner city kids, into parks, so they have park experiences. The Buddy Bison program, park experience program. We've got a military family program. We've got a college ambassador program going, which has been a lot of fun. So we're getting people out there to the parks. But what do we do to support better park experiences, to support better storytelling, so that there are stories about the parks that are more relevant to the various different people that we're getting out to the parks? And that's something we want to think about. But, since we're talking, any reactions you have, we can feed into the process as we, further improve our programs would be helpful.
Well, I think part of the problem is that whole issue of relevance. I think for communities of color, many of them have not. Let's look at tourism. The history of tourism in the national parks, and to a great degree, up until the 1960s, the story of the parks was not inflected toward communities of color. It was not inflected toward African Americans. It was not inflected toward Asian Americans. That all started to shift in the 1960s when JFK was president, Seward Udall was the Secretary of the Interior, and George Hartsog was the director of the National Park Service. That's when things began to shift. But I think to a great degree, it's like the story's the thing. If these communities of color hear a story that mirrors them, that reflects them, that has their pain and their joy, their anguish and their bliss in that story, then that's a draw right there. And I think that part of the problem with, for example, African Americans is that when I'm sharing this story and I'm getting all excited about it, they're wondering, why is he so excited? Why is he so passionate? And it's because there's what I refer to as a crisis of translation. If you grow up in an inner city community, whether it's Latinx, African American, Asian American, there's a high likelihood that no one in your community or very few have ever talked about the national park experience. So the result is your experience of a park is that park that your mom has told you, don't be there after sundown. If you come from a blue collar working class inner city community. And so you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And so what I've met, so I was at a Juneteenth celebration in Fresno a few years ago, speaking to an African-American woman, and I was getting so passionate and excited about talking about Yosemite. That's what connected with her. She was thinking, like, so why are you really are, you really love Yosemite? I remember her saying that, and I said, I love it because I know what's there and I've experienced it. You're not as passionate about Yosemite because you don't yet recognize what's there and what you own.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the key thing right there. It's
Yeah.
it's like talking to some, it's like Neil Armstrong talking about what it was like to be walking in the Sea of Tranquility. There are very few people in human history that knows what it felt like. So there's Neil, there's Buzz Aldrin. They know what that conversation, they know what it felt like. But for most other human beings, 99.9% of humanity have no idea what that felt like.
You know, this
And
is
so
reminding
for
me a
these-
bit of NPR did a little report recently on the college ambassador program that we're doing, and we're working with, among others, historically Black colleges and universities, and it traced the visit to caves, and I think it was Tennessee, Grace.
Mammoth Cave, that's correct.
Yeah, and these college students that were doing this experience, I mean, they're in college, they hadn't had experience like this before, and it was so moving for them. And you know, we've almost got to develop that new generation of leaders that can tell the stories for the younger kids that we're getting to the parks, to really have stories that are more relevant to them, that improve their experience.
Yeah.
But,
And the thing that's important to communicate is that there's a perception in the dominant culture that certain groups, ethnicities, however you want to put it, cannot connect with these sorts of environments, that cannot connect with the Grand Canyon or Zion or Arches or what have you. And the irony is that the opposite is true, is that the groups that have the greatest ability to connect with these environments are those groups that have had the least exposure to these environments.
yeah.
So for example, I remember leading a group of young African-American kids, you know, boys and girls. We're walking up to Lower Yosemite Fall. And I said, stay together. It's easy to lose you guys in this. There's so much crowding here because it's springtime. The falls are full. So we all need to stay together. And so, you know, you're walking up and it's going from a sunny, clear day to a cloudy day. And then eventually you can feel the mist and the rain coming. And it's from the waterfall. Before you even get to the waterfall, you feel its presence. And when we rounded that bend at Lower Yosemite Fall, one of the young people, a young man, had stayed there transfixed by what he was saying. He was just staring at it. And I told everyone, just stay there. I want to go back and make certain he's okay. I went back to him and I said, are you all right? And this is what he said to me. He said, yeah, I'm fine. I just had no idea that such beauty existed.
Yeah.
And that's the crisis of translation. We can talk all we want about Zion and Canyonlands and how beautiful it is, but until you see it and hear it and feel it, until you are in its presence, it is just a fact.
Yeah.
It is not a reality. It is not something that is experiential. And that's part of the problem, and that's the crisis of translation that I'm referring to. We have to get the young people into these environments for them to really appreciate them, because otherwise they have nothing. There's no lodestone that can connect them.
And that does.
That's the problem.
Because that's the first step. It's getting them there.
It's getting them there. Nothing is more. I mean, if there's a film, you know, that's virtual reality, I mean, that would you know, come close. But there's no greater reality than the real thing. You can write that down. There's no greater reality than the real thing. Nothing can substitute standing at the south rim of the Grand Canyon on a moonlit night or at sunrise. Nothing can mirror what it feels like to be at the top of a mountain to watch the sunrise. like Half Dome, for example, and what that feels like. You literally have to be there. And for those audiences that have never had those experiences, that have never had the advertising inflected to them so that they are aware that those experiences even exist, then it's like Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the Sea of Tranquility. They're the only two people, the handful of people in human history that know what that feels like. So that's the problem. That's the challenge, is to mirror that experience of astonishment and communicate that experience of astonishment to people who've never experienced anything like it. He's like, okay, I know. I mean, that's what the woman was saying to me. And when I was in Fresno, I know it's pretty. But when I looked at her and I said, there are places in this world that exceed the word pretty.
Mhm. Yeah.
You know, it's like when I'm reading some of the early history of Yosemite, and there was a gentleman, Euro-American, walking up on the trail that basically that's still there, the Bohono Trail that borders Highway 41. It's still right there, upslope from that. Just don't let people know that, right? And he's walking up, and then a person who had seen the view, you know, that's near that point, that's near Tunnel View, but it was different. There was a little bit up higher from that. You know, he sees the view as the old Wawona Road that I'm referring to. So he's rounding that bend, and they had that first initial view in the old Wawona Road. And the person's coming back, did you see it? What did you see? And the person said, I saw God. I mean, that was such a common response. And when you look at the romanticism and art, and you think about the romantic painters and how they were traveling, like the Hudson River School, the Hudson School, where they're all traveling around and they're trying to find the spot where the artist must have stood to take that painting, to create that rendering. It's that kind of experience that the audiences that I'm trying to reach are not privy to, have not been part of, but they need to be pulled into that history for them to be able to not so much to connect with that history, but to see why it is that we're excited. If you've never been to a national park, you can't understand John Muir's bliss about being in the range of light. Yeah. If you've never had that experience, if it were up to me, I would have Steven Spielberg make a film where you go into an inner city community and you literally grab people of color, you kidnap them, and you take them to Yosemite, and then you let them out at sunrise in Yosemite Valley, and this is what would happen. Are you insane? You can't just grab people off the road. And we're like,
yeah.
I would pay to see that film. And I think it kind of, you said if it were up to you, I think it is up to you. You should call Stephen and pass this along. But
Stephen and I, we don't.
Yeah, well, you know, pass it through Oprah or something. But I want to be mindful of time. You know, as other board members know, since taking over from Bill as chair, my goal has always been, no matter what else happens, we're going to end on time. I have been delighted that we broke that rule with you, because this has been great. So let's do this. If anyone has one last question, we can do just a super quick, you know, answer Shelton, and then I've got one last thing to close this out. And then the good news is that you are all over YouTube, and there's lots of great stuff to, you know, for folks who are interested to carry it forward. But before we go, anyone have one final quick question for Shelton? All right. Well, I will say this, Shelton, and I can see, you know, from everyone's, you know, faces, even those who have their camera on, what a delight this has been. You know, the award is called the American Park Experience Award. And I really feel like in talking to you, this was an American park experience, you know, that you are an American park experience for all that entails, you know, the good and the bad throughout its history and its natural beauty, and just combining all of that into one person and, you know, and one presentation is really remarkable. It's a real privilege. It's always a privilege. And you know, I think on behalf of the Park Trust and our board, our staff, our donors, you know, we just wanted to express our most profound thanks for the work that you're doing. And I think we're all ready to come out to Yosemite and spend some time with you as soon as maybe the weather turns a little bit, but we'll stay away from the waterfalls and we'll otherwise be careful. But really, just thank you. This was just fantastic.
Can I say one last thing?
Oh
And
yeah.
This is something for you folks. What the value of the National Park Trust and what you can do. I've always felt that every child in America deserves an experience of wonder, an experience of astonishment as part of their childhood. We refer to childhood as the wonder years. We leave out the wonder. And there's so many kids, who knows what could happen to these children all throughout the country who are Black or brown or what have you, that have not had these experiences. And if you could give them that experience of wonder, who knows what door that might open within themselves and what place it might take all of us to. That's my dream. That's my personal dream, is that every child in America has that experience of going, oh, and they're seeing the Grand Canyon for the first time, or they're there at sunrise in the North Cascades National Park, and they see their first grizzly bear. Nothing wakes you up more than turning in a trail and seeing a grizzly bear right there. I've had that experience 3 or 4 times in Yellowstone, but everyone deserves that experience. And you can't share that with people who've never had it and expect them to understand and feel what it is that you felt. It's something that you have to be there in its presence for it to resonate in your bones and your heart and in your spirit. And that's my dream, is that every child in America has that experience of wonder.
And that's
Let's
our
end on
dream
that.
too, Shelton. That's our dream too, Shelton. That's why we're so thankful for everybody who joined us tonight, because they are helping us reach that goal, that vision. And I am sure that after hearing from you, they will continue to help us reach that milestone, that important milestone. We can do it. But thank you so much, Shelton.
My pleasure.
This has been great.
This was great. Thanks
So
everybody
amazing.
for joining. Thank you, Shelton.
Thank you
Thank you,
all.
Dolores, for bringing us all
Have a
together.
lovely
Good night,
evening.
everybody.
If anyone's interested in the recording to share with someone, I can send it out afterwards to you. So you all